November 25, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The smell hit Wilhelm Hoffman before he saw anything. It drifted through the cold morning air like a memory from another life. Warm, rich, impossibly familiar. Roasted meat, butter, bread, something sweet, like the holidays his mother used to whisper about when Germany was still whole. He stood in line with 200 other German prisoners, boots planted on the gravel yard, breath fogging in front of him. It was Thanksgiving Day, though he didn't understand the significance of it yet. The guards did not shout. They did not stare with hatred. They simply waved the men forward toward the mess hall as though welcoming tired workers instead of captured enemies. When Wilhelm stepped through the doorway, he froze. On the long wooden tables lay trays of roasted turkey carved into thick slices, bowls of mashed potatoes swirled with golden butter. Cranberry sauce glistened like jewels in the dim light. There were baskets of soft dinner rolls, steam rising from them, and at the far end, pumpkin pies with crusts so perfect they looked unreal. For a moment, he thought it was a staging area for American officers. Some celebration he wasn't meant to see. But then the cook, a heavy-set Texan with forearms like hams, grinned at him, lifted a ladle, and said, "Next, step up, son." Son. Not prisoner, not enemy. Son. Wilhelm's hand shook as he raised his tin plate. The cook filled it without hesitation. Turkey, potatoes, gravy, a slice of pie. Enough food to feed 3 soldiers on the Eastern Front. Enough calories to feel sinful. He whispered in German, barely audible even to himself. "Das ist unmöglich. This is impossible." A man behind him muttered, "If this is food for prisoners, then America is not a nation. It is a paradise." No one disagreed. The smell of turkey wrapped around Wilhelm like a blanket. He felt his legs go slightly weak. His last months in North Africa had been nothing but dust, fear, and hunger. Bread so hard it cut the gums. Soup so thin it tasted like metal. Even officers lived on rations that shrunk each month as Reich supply lines collapsed under Allied bombing. But here, in the middle of a foreign land still at war, there was abundance that defied reason. A guard, barely older than Wilhelm himself, passed by with a stack of trays. His American uniform was crisp, his face smooth, his eyes clear. He offered a polite nod to the prisoners as though greeting customers at a cafe. Wilhelm had expected hatred when he arrived in the United States. He expected fists, boots, punishments. German propaganda had promised it. The Americans have no honor, the films had said. They humiliate prisoners. They starve them. They treat them like animals. But the truth stood before him in a way he could not escape. The Americans were feeding him like family. As Wilhelm moved to take a seat, he noticed the guards again. Young men, farm boys, sons of factory workers. They did not look heroic, but they looked steady, fed, strong, confident in a way no German soldier had looked since 1940. Their uniforms fit. Their boots weren't worn to paper. Their cheeks held color. It was then he remembered something an officer once whispered during the retreat in Tunisia. Germany fights with courage. America fights with factories. Factories? Yes. The numbers had been rumors whispered through the ranks, absurd, impossible claims about American production. 96,000 aircraft in a year, thousands of ships, endless tanks, rivers of steel, oil, wheat, corn, meat, a GDP larger than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. He hadn't believed it. No sane man would. But here he sat, staring at a plate of food so generous it felt like mockery. And for the first time, the numbers didn't seem absurd. They seemed inevitable. America wasn't straining under war. America was thriving under it. He lifted his fork. It trembled. The first bite of turkey nearly broke him. Not because it was good, though it was, but because it tasted like memory. Like his mother's Sunday dinners before everything turned gray and rationed. Like a life he'd forgotten he once had. His vision blurred for a moment. He blinked hard. Across the table, another POW whispered, "Why? Why would they give this to us?" Wilhelm didn't answer. He didn't know how. A guard approached their table, his tone casual. "Enjoy your meal, gents. Happy Thanksgiving." He tapped the table lightly. "You're safe here." Safe. The word landed like a blow. Wilhelm stared at the guard, trying to find hostility in his face, some sign of cruelty hiding behind the politeness, but all he saw was sincerity. And something else, a kind of quiet pride. Not pride in victory, pride in decency. Outside the mess hall windows, Texas stretched endlessly in every direction. Giant skies, endless fields, a landscape almost arrogant in its vastness. It felt like America itself was saying, "We have enough. Enough to feed our men. Enough to feed our enemies. Enough to show the world who we are." The realization hit Wilhelm with a force he was not prepared for. Germany is starving. America is feasting. And we, its prisoners, feast with them. He set his fork down slowly, the full weight of the moment pressing on him like gravity. "Why?" he whispered to no one. "Is the enemy treating us better than our own country ever did?" No one at the table had an answer, but all of them felt the same fear blooming quietly inside their chests, the terrifying possibility that the world they believed in, the world they fought for, might have been built on lies. A world where the enemy showed more humanity than the fatherland ever had. And as Wilhelm lifted his fork again, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing about this war made sense anymore. Wilhelm Hoffman did not taste the rest of his Thanksgiving meal. His fork moved, but each bite landed like a stone in his stomach. Kindness, he told himself, was never free. Not in war, not in life, and certainly not from the enemy. He had learned that lesson in Tunisia. The memory rose uninvited, sharp as broken glass. February 1943, Kasserine Pass. His unit had been running on half rations for weeks. Bread so thin it fell apart in their hands, a smear of margarine that tasted like dust. He remembered sucking on pebbles to keep the saliva flowing. He remembered watching a boy from Hamburg, barely 19, collapse from heat and hunger, his skin gray, his lips cracked like old leather. They had been told the Reich would feed them. They had been told the Reich could feed the world. But by 1943, Germany was feeding no one. The day he was captured, Wilhelm had been crawling under the wreckage of a half-burned truck, searching for a water canister. American artillery thundered in the distance. Allied armor was pushing forward like an iron tide. When he finally lifted his hands above his head and stepped out into the open, his heart had hammered with a single belief. The Americans will torture you. The Americans will kill you. Better to die fighting. That belief had been carved into him by years of propaganda. Posters in every barracks showed Americans as animals, grinning monsters with crooked teeth, knives dripping with German blood. Films warned that American soldiers mutilated prisoners, mocked them, starved them, displayed them like trophies. Even his company sergeant, a hard man who feared nothing, had whispered once, "Better a German grave than an American prison." So when an American corporal approached Wilhelm on the battlefield that day, rifle lowered, canteen extended, Wilhelm had flinched so violently the soldier had taken a step back. "You're all right," the American had said. "Drink." Wilhelm had stared at the canteen like it was a snake. He didn't drink. He couldn't. The corporal finally shrugged and pressed it into his hands anyway. Now, sitting in the mess hall at Camp Herne with a plate of food fit for a German general, Wilhelm felt the same warning rise inside him. A voice that whispered, "This is the trap. Kindness is the first step. Cruelty comes after." He swallowed hard and forced himself to breathe. The line of memories grew darker. Sicily after the retreat. He remembered standing guard outside a supply depot in the dead of night, hearing the officers argue inside. They spoke in frustrated whispers, but the walls were thin. "The Americans bomb the rails and the ports," one officer had said. "Every week our supplies shrink." Another voice had replied bitterly, "Meanwhile, they feed their soldiers like kings. Their farms could feed all of Europe twice over." Wilhelm had laughed then, quietly, bitterly. The idea was absurd. No nation could be that rich. Yet here he was in Texas, a prisoner of war, holding more food on his plate than his family in Bavaria would see in a week. As he finished the last bite of pie, he heard chairs scraping across the floor. A guard opened the side door to the shower building and called out, "After you eat, line up for processing. You'll get cleaned up." The words should have been ordinary, but Wilhelm's blood went cold. Showers. Every German soldier had heard the rumors. Stories whispered during transport, spread by terrified voices in the dark corners of barracks. Stories of captured men marched into sealed rooms. Stories of gas. Stories of choking and death. He found himself unable to move. A fellow POW at the next table muttered, "They fatten us first, then they kill us." Another said, "This is what they do. They make you relax." The fear tightened Wilhelm's throat. He wished, absurdly, for the certainty of the front. There, at least, death made sense. The guards gestured again. "Move it along, gentlemen." Gentlemen. That made it worse. Wilhelm rose from the table, each step heavy, each breath shallow. The line formed slowly outside the shower building, a long, low structure with steam drifting from under the eaves. It smelled clean. Soap and hot water. Too clean. In the Africa campaign, water had been rationed to mouthfuls. Showers were a distant luxury, sometimes months apart. Germany's rail lines were collapsing under Allied bombing. Berliners were living on 200 grams of meat a week. Soap was more valuable than cigarettes. Warm water was a dream. And yet here, in a country fighting a two-front war, hot water ran freely. It defied logic. It terrified him. As the line moved forward, Wilhelm's hands began to tremble. The hiss of the pipes inside the building sounded too much like gas, too much like the stories whispered by men who claimed to have seen things they could never unsee. When his turn finally came, a guard opened the door and waved him in. "Towels are on the bench. Leave your clothes, you'll get them back." The man's voice was calm, polite, casual. It didn't help. Inside, the showers were nothing more than rows of metal pipes, tiled walls, and a drain. But to Wilhelm it felt like stepping into a furnace of unseen intentions. A medic approached, holding a clipboard. "We're just going to delouse you, check for infections. Standard procedure." Standard procedure. Wilhelm's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Then, something unexpected happened. A POW ahead of him stepped under one of the pipes. Hot water poured out immediately, steaming as it hit his skin. The man gasped, not in pain, but in relief. Another POW began to laugh. A real laugh, then another, then another. The fear loosened just enough for Wilhelm to breathe. Tentatively, he reached out his hand and let the water hit his fingers. Warm, gentle, human. He stepped fully into the stream, and for the first time in months, dirt and sweat and fear began to wash away. The water ran brown at his feet. His eyes stung, not from soap, but from the overwhelming contradiction of it all. Why would the enemy give us this? Why would they waste hot water on us? Why would they treat us with dignity when our own country could not afford to? When he left the shower area, wrapped in a clean towel, the guard handed him fresh clothes, soft, laundered, smelling of sun and cotton. "Welcome to Texas," the guard said with a small smile. Wilhelm nodded stiffly. He didn't have the courage to respond. As he walked back toward the barracks, he caught sight of an American flag fluttering above the yard. Bright, strong, untouched by war. That was when the thought finally clawed its way into his mind, unbidden and unwelcome. How can a nation fighting across the entire world still have enough to treat its prisoners like this, when Germany can no longer even feed its own children? The question lingered, heavy and impossible. Kindness still felt like a trick, but the real fear, the deeper fear, came from something far more dangerous. What if this wasn't a trick at all? What if this was simply who the Americans were? Wilhelm Hoffman woke before dawn the next morning, long before the bugle sounded across Camp Hearn. For the first time in months, he had slept through the night. The barracks bunk was simple. Wood frame, thin mattress, wool blanket, but to a man who had spent the last year on sand, concrete, or metal flooring, it felt like luxury. He lay still for a moment, staring at the rafters overhead, listening to the quiet breathing of the men around him. It was the quiet that unnerved him most. German camps had never been quiet. Officers barked orders at dawn. Boots slammed on floors. Men coughed, fought, argued, trembled. Fear filled every crack of every morning. But here, the silence felt calm, natural, safe. He sat up and found a neatly folded bundle at the foot of his bunk, a set of clean denim work clothes stamped PW, a pair of socks, and a brown towel. A small note lay on top in careful handwriting. "Laundry day is Thursday. Bring these to the wash house." Wilhelm touched the fabric, surprised by its softness. In the Afrika Korps, uniforms had been washed in cold water that smelled of rust. Wool shrank, cotton tore, seams unraveled. But these were sturdy, made for labor, but made to last. He frowned. Why would they give prisoners clothes better than what many German civilians were wearing by 1943? As the sun crested the horizon, prisoners gathered outside for roll call. The guards stood in formation, lankier than German soldiers perhaps, but broader through the shoulders, better fed, better rested. They looked like farm boys, mechanics, factory workers, ordinary Americans thrust into a global war. One guard, a young man with sandy hair and freckles, caught Wilhelm's eye and nodded politely as if greeting a neighbor. It unsettled him more than hatred would have. After roll call, a sergeant directed Wilhelm's group toward the medical building. He hesitated at the door, half expecting another moment of fear, another trap hidden behind kindness. But when he stepped inside, he found a medic waiting with a smile that reached his eyes. "Morning," the medic said. "Let's take a look at you." Wilhelm stiffened instinctively. The medic noticed. "Don't worry," he said gently. "We follow the rules. Geneva Convention, you know? You'll get the same care our boys get." Wilhelm studied his face, searching for sarcasm. He found none. The medic examined his hands, scarred from the desert sun and weeks without proper water. Then he checked Wilhelm's lungs, listened to his heartbeat, inspected his teeth. His motions were methodical but careful, not rushed, not dismissive, When Wilhelm winced as the medic pressed a rib, the man paused and said quietly, "Old injury. We'll get you something for the pain." No German doctor had ever spoken to him like that. No German doctor had ever had the supplies, too. When the exam finished, the medic placed a small envelope of pills in Wilhelm's palm. "Take one with food," he said, "and drink plenty of water. Texas heat'll fry you if you're not careful." Wilhelm nodded, stunned by the concern. Back outside, the prisoners were divided into work details. Wilhelm was assigned to a group repairing fences near the outer perimeter. A truck pulled up, loaded with tools, coils of barbed wire, and a cooler filled with ice water. Actual ice. The sight of it nearly made him dizzy. In Tunisia, ice might as well have been a myth. A cowboy climbed out of the truck, broad hat, worn boots, easy stride. He carried himself with the relaxed confidence of a man who had never been hungry a day in his life. "All right, boys," the cowboy said in slow, clear English, "you work with me today." He pointed at a row of posts in the distance. "We'll be mending that section." The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. Work was expected. But working alongside Americans, without rifles pointed at them? As they approached the fence line, Wilhelm's boot sank into a patch of mud left by last night's rain. His foot slid, and before he could catch himself, he toppled forward with a splash, landing on his hands and knees. The prisoners behind him stiffened. In Germany, an accident like that would have meant shouting, maybe a blow from a boot. Clumsiness was weakness. Weakness was punishable. But the cowboy simply laughed, a warm, rolling sound, and reached out a hand. "Easy there, partner," he said. "Texas mud'll grab you if you're not paying attention." Wilhelm stared at the outstretched hand as if it were a weapon. The cowboy kept it there, steady and patient. Finally, Wilhelm took it. The cowboy hauled him up with surprising gentleness, brushed the mud from his sleeve, and slapped him lightly on the shoulder. "Happens to all of us," he said. Wilhelm felt something crack inside him then. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible. Just a small fracture in the wall he'd carried since Tunisia. The cowboy handed him a canteen. "Drink. It's hot out here." Wilhelm unscrewed the cap and took a tentative sip. Cold water spilled across his tongue, so crisp and clean it almost hurt. He hadn't tasted water like that since before the war. He looked up at the cowboy. "Why?" he asked in halting English. "Why you give?" The man blinked. "Because you're working," he said. "And because you're human. That's reason enough. Human. Not soldier, not enemy, not number. Human." The word settled over Wilhelm like a blanket he didn't know how to wear. As the morning went on, he watched the American workers more closely. They moved with a kind of effortless rhythm, passing tools, tightening wires, driving posts into the earth with practiced efficiency. They joked quietly among themselves, sang snatches of songs under their breath, spoke of home, farms, sweethearts, fishing trips, baseball. They did not speak of hatred. They did not speak of vengeance. When one guard noticed a prisoner struggling with a fence tool, he didn't bark an order. He walked over, demonstrated the correct grip, and said, "Like this. Watch your hand. Don't want you getting cut." Wilhelm watched, incredulous. He thought of Germany's industrial collapse, of bombed-out factories, of ration lines stretching for blocks. He thought of his mother writing to him in cramped handwriting, saying she stood 3 hours for a loaf of bread, 200 grams of meat a week, children fainting in school, entire towns going without electricity. Yet here, this country fighting across 2 oceans, supplying millions of troops, building ships and planes faster than anyone could count. still had enough time and resources to treat prisoners with care. It didn't make sense. It contradicted everything he'd ever been told. By noon, the sun burned high above them. The cowboy whistled and waved for everyone to gather beside the truck. He lowered the tailgate, opened the cooler, and pulled out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. "Lunch break," he said. The prisoners hesitated until the cowboy added, "Eat. You're safe here." The same words the guard had said yesterday. The same tone. The same quiet conviction. Wilhelm accepted the sandwich. Bread soft, meat thick, cheese melting from the heat. He ate slowly, almost reverently, not out of fear anymore, but awe. As he chewed, he looked around, not just at the men but at the camp beyond the fence. Rows of orderly barracks, laundry flapping in the wind, a library building, a baseball field, a small chapel. Everything designed with purpose, everything clean, maintained, intentional. It looked less like a prison and more like a town built by a nation so confident in its strength that it didn't need cruelty to prove its dominance. He thought again of the medic's gentle hands, of the cowboy's outstretched arm in the mud, of the guard's soft voice saying, "You're safe here." And slowly, almost unwillingly, something began to unfold in Wilhelm's chest, a fragile, impossible thought. What if the Americans weren't pretending? What if this decency was real? A breeze swept across the Texas plain, warm and carrying the scent of cut hay and distant smoke. The cowboy adjusted his hat against the sun and grinned at the group of prisoners sitting in the shade. "Well," he said, "let's finish this fence. Still plenty of daylight left." As Wilhelm stood, he felt the fracture inside him widen, not painfully, but as though light were finally finding its way through. For the first time since capture, he did not feel afraid. He felt confused, and underneath that confusion, something even more dangerous: hope. The breakdown did not happen all at once. It never does. It came slowly, like thawing ice, quiet, soft, and then suddenly catastrophic. For Wilhelm Hoffman, it began with a sound. It was 4 days after the Thanksgiving meal. The sun had already dipped behind the barracks, leaving long shadows stretching across Camp Hearn. Wilhelm was walking back from work detail, boots crunching on gravel, when he heard a faint melody drifting through the evening air. A guitar, American chords, warm, unhurried, familiar to no one but comforting all the same. He stopped walking. The music came from near the officer's hut, where a few guards sat in a loose circle on overturned crates. One plucked the strings while another tapped his boot rhythmically on the dirt. They weren't performing. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They were simply playing the way men do after a long day of honest work. Wilhelm felt something inside him tighten. He'd grown up hearing his father hum old folk songs from Bavaria while fixing boots by the fireplace. Music had always been a symbol of home, of safety, of warmth, of a world before war. And here, in a camp on the other side of the world, the enemy played as though nothing separated their lives from his. He stood perfectly still, unable to move. The guard nearest him noticed and called out, "Evening, buddy. Long day?" Buddy. That was another crack in the wall he had built. He wanted to walk away, to shut it out, to protect the fragile dam of logic holding him together. But the cords kept drifting into him, gentle and relentless, like water wearing down stone. He was still frozen there when the cook, Red McIntyre, appeared behind him, carrying a covered tray. "You boys hungry?" Red called to the guards. He lifted the lid. The smell hit Wilhelm like a blow. Steak, thick slices, seared edges, juices glistening in the lamplight. It was the richest, most indulgent smell Wilhelm had inhaled since 1941. His legs almost buckled. A memory surged up before he could stop it. His mother frying meat on a Sunday morning, his father slicing it thin to stretch it for everyone. But that was before rationing, before shortages, before Germany began cutting meals in half, then in half again. Before the Reich stretched its reach too far and the world pushed back. His throat closed, his hands trembled. Red noticed. "You all right, son?" Wilhelm couldn't answer. He stared at the food like it might evaporate. One of the guards stepped forward. "Red, give him a piece. He looks like he's about to faint." Red hesitated only for a second before nodding. "Grab a plate, kid." Wilhelm didn't move. Red frowned, then simply tore a piece of meat off with his fingers, still hot, and placed it gently into Wilhelm's shaking hands. And that was when the dam broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. Wilhelm's breath hitched, his vision blurred. The smell, the music, the warmth of the meat in his palm. It was too much, too real, too kind. His knees gave out and he dropped into the dirt. He didn't fall unconscious. He didn't scream. He simply knelt, shoulders trembling, head bowed like a man crushed under a weight he could not lift. Red crouched beside him. "Easy. Easy, son." The words were gentle, fatherly, but they made Wilhelm flinch as if struck. "Why?" he whispered, voice cracking. "Why are you feeding us like this? We are the enemy." Red put a hand on his shoulder, a steady hand, warm, human. "Son, war or not," he said quietly, "a man ought to eat." Wilhelm's breath caught. That sentence should have been simple, ordinary, but it shattered every belief he had carried from Germany. In the desert, Germans rationed bread by the ounce. In Berlin, families boiled potatoes in water twice to stretch the calories. In Hamburg, children fainted in school from hunger. Germany fed its soldiers with whatever was left and its prisoners with almost nothing. But here, America fed even its enemies with dignity. He choked out another question, barely audible. "Why do you treat us like people?" Red looked at him for a long moment, then spoke as though explaining something obvious. "Because you are people." Wilhelm closed his eyes. His chest tightened. Tears rose uninvited, hot, humiliating, unstoppable. He wasn't crying from joy or gratitude or even relief. He was crying because the truth hurt. He had been told the enemy was evil. He had been told Americans were barbarians. He had been told surrender meant torture or death. But the enemy cooked him steak. The enemy shared water. The enemy played music under the Texas sky. The enemy cared whether he lived or died. And the realization tore through him with the violence of a shell blast. The enemy wasn't America. The enemy was the lie. Red helped him to sit on a wooden crate. A guard handed him a cup of Coca-Cola, cold, fizzy, dark as molasses. Wilhelm had never seen such a drink. He lifted it to his lips, took a sip, and jerked as the bubbles exploded on his tongue. He stared at the drink in disbelief. The guard chuckled. "First time? It's just Coke. You'll get used to it." Wilhelm didn't understand half the words, but he understood the kindness. And again he felt tears threaten the edges of his vision. He looked down at the cup, at the steak cooling in his hand. His voice shook. "My family, back home, they have nothing. Children starve, cities burn, and I—" His throat closed. "I eat this?" Red sat beside him. The man's broad shoulders blocked the cold wind. "That ain't your fault, son," he said softly. "You didn't start this mess." Wilhelm shook his head violently. "No, but I fought in it. His voice cracked again. "I believed the lies." Red exhaled slowly. "We all believe something until we learn better." They sat there under the darkening sky, the guitar still humming nearby, the smell of meat still curling in the air. Prisoners walked past. Some slowed. Some stared. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the rawness of the moment. But every man understood, because every man had felt the same fracture forming inside him, whether he admitted it or not. Wilhelm finally whispered, "I do not understand this country." Red chuckled gently. "Most of us don't either." Wilhelm tried to smile. It came out crooked, strained. Red slapped his knee lightly. "Eat before it gets cold." Wilhelm obeyed, not because he was hungry, though he was, not because he had no choice, though he didn't, but because something profound, something ancient, had settled inside him. He took a bite, and it was too much, too rich, too tender, too generous. He closed his eyes as another wave of emotion rose. This time he didn't fight it. A tear slipped free and rolled down his cheek, tracing a line of dirt and shame and relief. Red pretended not to notice. After a long moment, Wilhelm spoke again, voice barely audible. "I do not deserve this." Red pulled a toothpick from behind his ear. He placed it between his teeth, leaned back and looked at Wilhelm with a quiet, steady sadness. "Son," he said, "ain't none of us get what we deserve in war. We just do the best we can." The guitar played on, soft, gentle, forgiving. That night, Wilhelm lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling for hours, unable to sleep. The breakdown had left him hollow, emptied of certainty. Every belief he had defended, every slogan he had repeated, every fear he had carried, none of it fit any more. What kind of country fed its prisoners like sons? What kind of army let enemy soldiers listen to music by their fires? What kind of people looked a captive in the eye and saw a man instead of a monster? He thought of Germany, cold, hungry, bombed, crumbling under the weight of its own ambitions. He thought of children standing in bread lines, of mothers trading jewelry for flour, of cities lit by flames instead of lamps. And then he thought of America, feeding prisoners steak on a work night. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, swallowing hard. The truth was devastating. The truth was undeniable. The truth was this: America had defeated Germany long before the war was over, not with bombs, not with bullets, but with abundance, with dignity, with decency. And for the first time, Wilhelm Hoffmann understood the full meaning of what he had seen. It wasn't just his body that had been captured, it was his entire world view, and America was setting it free. The morning after Wilhelm Hoffmann's breakdown, he woke with eyes swollen and a heaviness in his chest he struggled to name. Shame, perhaps. Gratitude he couldn't express. Confusion he could barely contain. But beneath all of it, deep, quiet, persistent, lay something new: understanding. He dressed slowly, listening to the rustle of blankets and murmurs of men waking around him. No one mentioned what had happened by the officer's hut the night before. In the culture they had come from, a soldier crying was a disgrace. But here, among men who had lived the same contradictions, silence was its own form of respect. At roll call, Wilhelm studied the guards more closely than he ever had. They stood in a relaxed line, rifles slung casually, uniforms slightly mismatched, some wearing jackets open, some buttoned tight. No rigid formation, no shouted commands, no obsession with perfect posture. What he saw troubled him. These men weren't identical. They weren't shaped by uniformity. They weren't cut from one mold. They were different. One guard was a tall black man, laughing with a shorter white soldier from Tennessee. Another was a Mexican-American from El Paso, switching effortlessly between Spanish and English as he teased a boyish recruit from Iowa. A Jewish corporal adjusted his glasses while chatting amicably with a Catholic sergeant who wore a tiny cross on his dog tags. Different backgrounds, different faiths, different faces. Yet they worked together as though none of it mattered. In Germany, such a thing was unthinkable. The Reich demanded purity, sameness, obedience. It insisted strength came from exclusion, cutting away anything that didn't fit the ideal. But here, in this strange country, strength seemed to come from the opposite, from welcoming all kinds, all stories, all lives. What unnerved Wilhelm wasn't just that America allowed it was that America thrived because of it. At breakfast, he noticed more things that unsettled his old beliefs. The cook who served him was a red-haired Methodist who hummed gospel hymns under his breath. The guard beside him recited a quick prayer before eating, something Wilhelm had never seen a German officer do outside the most formal ceremonies. Another guard read a newspaper with headlines about factory workers in Detroit, women filling roles men had left behind, building planes faster than the war could destroy them. There was no centralized command forcing these men to behave a certain way, no officer threatening punishment for deviation. They acted with a kind of quiet freedom Wilhelm couldn't understand, freedom based not on fear, but on confidence, confidence in themselves, in their system, in each other. He had grown up believing discipline was the only path to order, that fear was the only tool powerful enough to unite a nation. But what he saw in America was something else entirely. A country where unity wasn't forced. It was chosen. A country where strength wasn't imposed. It was cultivated. A country where morality wasn't propaganda. It was lived. These realizations came slowly at first, then all at once. Later that week, Wilhelm found himself assigned to cotton sorting duty in one of the large storage sheds. As he worked beside other prisoners, he kept glancing toward the open door, drawn by the sound of voices outside. A group of guards had gathered near a jeep discussing the war, but they weren't shouting slogans. They weren't repeating lines drilled into them by government broadcasts. They weren't even talking about victory with triumph or hatred. They spoke of responsibility. "We don't want to take over the world," one guard said as he leaned against the jeep. "We just want to end this thing and get home." Another nodded. "We do our job. We keep our heads down, and we try to be decent. That's all." Decent! It was such a simple word, but it hit Wilhelm like a hammer. In Germany, decency had been redefined, twisted into loyalty, obedience, sacrifice. In America, it meant something older, something human. He stopped working for a moment, his hands hovering over the cotton sacks as he listened. "You hear what the captain said?" another guard added. "We treat POWs right because it's the law, but also because it's the right thing to do. Someday they'll go home, and we want them to remember how we treated them." Ethical supremacy. The phrase didn't exist yet in any textbook, but the idea already lived in these men. America wasn't only winning the war, it was winning the moral high ground. That afternoon, Wilhelm stood near the fence line during a short break. A guard was handing out mail, thin envelopes stamped with the red ink of the censor's office. When Wilhelm's name was called, he felt the breath leave his lungs. He hadn't received a letter in months. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a short note from his mother in Bavaria, written in her familiar looping script. She spoke of long lines at the butcher shop, of ration coupons dwindling, of neighbors losing their homes in bombing raids, of children being sent to countryside shelters because the cities were no longer safe. But there was something else, too. Hope. She wrote, "We heard that soldiers captured in America are safe. Some say they are well fed. Some say they are treated better than civilians here. If it is true, then you must not be afraid." He read the words again. "You must not be afraid." The letter slipped from his fingers. He pressed a hand to his mouth to suppress the sob rising in his throat. His own mother, surviving on scraps, living under thunderous bombardment, found comfort in the idea that her son, a prisoner of the enemy, was being treated humanely. And she was right. The enemy wasn't America. The enemy was everything that had led him here. The deception he had swallowed, the ideology he had defended, the lies he had believed. That night, in the quiet of the barracks, Wilhelm wrote his first letter home. He hunched over the wooden table, pen trembling in his hand, and began. "Mother, I must tell you something. It will sound impossible, but it is the truth. The Americans do not hurt us. They do not starve us. They feed us well, better than soldiers at the front. They give us music, clean clothes, work that makes sense. They treat us like men, not enemies. Men." He paused, breath shaking. Then he wrote another sentence, a sentence that felt like treason to everything he had once believed. "The enemy is not America. The enemy was the lie I grew up with." He stared at the words for a long time, the ink still wet. His entire life had been shaped by orders, slogans, speeches, posters, promises that Germany was strong, righteous, destined to conquer. But the truth was here, in this camp, in these ordinary Americans who showed mercy instead of vengeance. America's power did not come from cruelty. It did not come from domination. It came from principle, from a belief that dignity was not a privilege but a right, even for a prisoner. And Wilhelm saw clearly now. It was this moral purpose combined with unimaginable industrial strength that made America unstoppable. A nation united not by fear, but by values, a generation shaped not by propaganda, but by sacrifice. A people fighting not to conquer, but to protect a world worth living in. The greatest generation. Wilhelm folded the letter carefully and sealed it. As he blew out the lantern beside his bunk, he felt something shift inside him. Quiet, but irreversible. He no longer feared the Americans. He admired them. The longer Wilhelm Hoffmann lived inside Camp Herne, the more he realized he was witnessing something larger than the war, something that had nothing to do with battles or borders. He was seeing America, not as a soldier sees an enemy, but as a man watching a country reveal its character piece by piece. It began with small, ordinary moments. Moments so simple they might have been invisible to someone born here. But to a man raised inside a system built on fear and hierarchy, they were astonishing. One evening, while walking back from the work fields, he heard shouts from across the compound. Sharp, energetic, but filled with laughter rather than anger. He followed the sound to the baseball diamond beside the library hut. A group of American guards were playing baseball under the fading Texas sunlight. Their movements were quick and practiced, boots pounding the dirt, gloves snapping, voices calling across the field. "Good swing, Wilson! Run, you slow poke! Safe at second!" They shouted insults with grins on their faces. They tackled each other, argued over calls, celebrated small victories with whoops and handshakes. Competition without cruelty, strength without intimidation, playfulness without punishment. Wilhelm watched from the fence, arms crossed loosely over his chest, feeling something he couldn't quite name. Envy, perhaps, or longing. He had never seen German officers play anything with their subordinates. Sports in the Reich were rigid, organized, nationalistic, meant to shape the body for war, not joy. But here, these Americans simply loved the game, loved the moment, loved being alive. Later that same night, as the sky turned purple and the first stars emerged, a cowboy guard sat on the tailgate of a truck just outside the barracks, playing harmonica. The melody drifted across the camp like a warm breeze, slow, reflective, tender. A tune that sounded like home even though Wilhelm had never heard anything like it. Some POWs leaned against the fence to listen. Others sat quietly on the steps of their barracks. No one spoke. No one dared interrupt. And the cowboy didn't play like a performer. He played the way one prays. Softly, sincerely, offering a piece of himself to the night. In that moment, under the Texas sky, Wilhelm felt something settle deep inside him. This country had a soul shaped not by conquest, but by compassion, not by ideology, but by everyday decency, not by fear, but by faith. He saw it in other ways, too. Every Saturday, trucks from nearby towns arrived carrying donated goods for the prisoners, blankets, books, magazines, and sometimes fresh fruit from local farms. Families who had sons fighting overseas still found the kindness to send oranges or apples to German prisoners who had once been taught to hate them. During December, the camp decorated the administrative building with pine branches and simple strings of lights. A sign appeared near the mess hall. Christmas packages for POWs will be distributed December 24th. Packages for prisoners. On Christmas Eve, Wilhelm received a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a knitted pair of gloves, 3 pieces of hard candy, a small New Testament, and a handwritten note. We do this because it's the season of mercy. May it remind you of home. A family in Texas. Wilhelm held the note for a long time, reading it again and again. No name, no signature. Just a simple gesture from strangers with no obligation to kindness. The glove's stitching was uneven. Handmade, not factory-made. Someone, somewhere, had taken hours to knit something warm for a man who had once marched under the banner of their enemy. Germany would never have done the same. Not in 1943. Not ever. Through all these moments, Wilhelm began to see the blueprint of the America around him. This was a country fueled by workers, men and women proud of their craft, their farms, their families. A country built not on the backs of terrified citizens, but on the shoulders of free people who believed their nation was worth more than fear. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Pittsburgh had become the beating heart of the Allied war machine. Women, known as Rosie the Riveters, welded steel, assembled bombers, and filled warehouses with engines and ammunition. Farmers produced so much wheat, corn, beef, and dairy that America could feed entire armies and still have enough to feed prisoners. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't superiority. It was unity. A unity that Germany had never known. A unity rooted in the belief that moral purpose mattered, that a country's greatness came not from domination, but from character. Wilhelm saw it in the way guards spoke respectfully to older POWs. He saw it in the way they wrote letters home, full of concern for their families, not hatred for the enemy. He saw it in the way they prayed before meals, thanking God not for victory, but for safety. One Sunday, while working near the chapel, Wilhelm overheard a guard's quiet prayer. Lord, help us get through this war with our humanity intact. Humanity intact. It startled him. In Germany, humanity had been considered a weakness. Here it was seen as something to protect, something to fight for. Every day revealed another piece of America's identity. A middle-class nation proud of its homes, its churches, its schools, a place where workers believed in responsibility, where kindness was a virtue, and where decency wasn't a performance. It was a habit. And although Wilhelm couldn't fully articulate it yet, He felt the comparison forming in his mind like a shadow he couldn't ignore. This is what a united nation looks like. This is what strength rooted in goodness feels like. This is what Germany could never have been under the Reich. The contrast was painful. Germany was starving, families surviving on 200 grams of meat a week, cities reduced to rubble. Civilians living in fear, soldiers fighting on empty stomachs, hope dwindling with each passing month. America, meanwhile, was feeding its enemies steak and gifting them harmonicas for Christmas. One night, as Wilhelm lay on his bunk staring at the moonlit ceiling, he whispered to himself, This is America. This is the country we were told to fear." The realization washed over him softly, with a strange ache of admiration and envy. The greatness of America wasn't its weapons, or its factories, or its armies. It was its values, its belief that enemies were still human, its willingness to treat prisoners with dignity, its strange, stubborn faith that kindness could withstand war. For the first time, Wilhelm understood why the guards carried themselves with such quiet certainty, why they could smile without arrogance and offer mercy without hesitation. They believed they were part of something good, something steady, something worth defending. And as he drifted to sleep, he felt a small, unexpected thought take root inside him. If this is America, then the world might still have a chance. The day Wilhelm Hoffmann left America arrived with the same quiet dignity that had defined his months in captivity. There were no speeches, no banners, no triumphant music, just the long shadows of dawn stretching across the docks at Galveston, the smell of salt and engine oil, and the muted shuffling of hundreds of German prisoners boarding the transport ship that would take them home. Home. The word no longer meant what it once had. Wilhelm stepped onto the deck and turned back toward the coastline. Texas lay behind him in a wash of soft oranges and golds, the early sun rising over the flat horizon. He gripped the railing with both hands, committing every detail to memory. The docks, the warehouses, the waving silhouettes of American guards standing in neat rows. They were not there to intimidate. They were not there to remind the prisoners of defeat. They were simply there to say goodbye. One of the guards spotted Wilhelm and raised a hand. It was the young man with sandy hair, the same guard who had once said, "You're safe here," with that gentle, uncomplicated sincerity unique to Americans. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called out over the Gulf wind, "Take care, buddy, buddy." Even on the last day, even as Wilhelm was boarding a ship bound for a devastated homeland. Wilhelm felt something tighten in his chest. Not sorrow, not fear, but a kind of ache reserved for things precious and fleeting. He raised his hand in return, unsure if the guard could see the gesture from this distance. Around him, some POWs stood stiffly, unwilling to show emotion. Others wiped at their eyes openly. A few tried to memorize the moment the way Wilhelm was, quietly, reverently, knowing they would never again see a country like this one. The ship's horn sounded, a deep, resonant call. Lines were pulled in. Engines began to churn. Texas started to drift away. Wilhelm stayed at the railing long after most prisoners had gone below deck. His mind wandered to the small, ordinary moments that had transformed him. The hot water cascading over his shoulders in the shower house, the cowboy lifting him from the mud, the medic checking his ribs with gentle hands, the first cold sip of Coca-Cola. The music played under a purple Texas sky. Moments that rewrote everything he thought he knew about war, about America, about himself. A soft voice at his side pulled him from his thoughts. "Does it feel strange, leaving this place?" It was Franz, another POW from his barracks. Wilhelm nodded slowly. More than strange. What will you tell them? Back home? Franz asked. Wilhelm's fingers tightened around the railing. The Gulf breeze tugged at his hair, carrying with it scents he knew he would never forget. Salt, cotton, diesel, and something else he couldn't name. Something that smelled like possibility. I will tell them the truth, he said quietly. The truth they deserve to know. Franz waited. Wilhelm exhaled. I came here as a prisoner. I am leaving as a witness. Franz said nothing. There was nothing to add. Because Wilhelm had captured in those words what every man aboard that ship now understood. The Reich had taught them to fear America. The war had taught them to resent it. But captivity, unexpectedly, impossibly, had taught them to respect it. America had not broken them with cruelty. America had not crushed them with hunger. America had not sought revenge. Instead, America had fed them, clothed them, treated their wounds, given them purpose, given them dignity. And in doing so, America had won something far more powerful than a battle. It had won their hearts. As the coastline faded into a thin line, Wilhelm felt a sudden urge to memorize everything, like a man afraid of losing the last pages of a book that changed his life. He closed his eyes and whispered the truth he knew he would carry across the ocean, across the ruins of Germany, across the rest of his life. America defeated us not by cruelty, but by compassion. He imagined standing in his mother's kitchen someday, telling her about the clean barracks, the warm meals, the Christmas gifts from strangers who owed him nothing. He imagined telling his future children that their father had once been captured by a nation strong enough to be merciful, strong enough to show the world another way to win. Behind him, the German prisoners began to gather along the deck, drawn instinctively toward the fading horizon. Some stood shoulder to shoulder, others stayed apart, but all watched silently as the land of their captivity grew smaller and smaller, swallowed by shimmering waves. No one spoke. No one needed to. Wilhelm knew this moment was not just his memory. It was their collective inheritance, a reminder of the men who guarded them, the cooks who fed them, the farmers who lent them tools, the families who sent them mittens and candy at Christmas. A reminder of the America that had existed in 1943 to 45, unbreakable, united, decent. A nation tempered by hardship but guided by conscience. A nation whose greatness came not from power alone, but from goodness. As Texas dissolved into the horizon, Wilhelm placed a hand over his heart in silent gratitude. To the greatest generation, he whispered, you showed the world what humanity looks like. The ship turned east, carrying hundreds of men who no longer feared America, but admired it. Men who would spend the rest of their lives telling anyone who would listen that, in the darkest years of the war, their enemy had shown them the meaning of mercy. And in that truth, carried across oceans and decades, America's legacy lived on.